I took a job as a housemaid and found a locked bedroom by Joan Savage. Chapter 1. The Perfect Job. The first night I spent in the Blackwood house, I woke at 2:17 in the morning to the sound of someone whispering my name from behind a locked door. I want to be clear about that, because everything that happened afterward, everything I am about to tell you, started with that single moment. Not the interview, not the drive up through the pines with my whole life crammed into the back of a 12-year-old Honda. Not even the relief of seeing the house for the first time, glass and cedar rising out of the Vermont fog like something out of a magazine I could never afford to be photographed in. It started with my name, spoken so softly I convinced myself, for the length of 3 heartbeats, that I had imagined it. I hadn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. 3 weeks earlier, in a cramped studio apartment in Burlington with a mattress on the floor and an eviction notice taped to the refrigerator like some kind of sick joke. My name is Claire Morgan. I was 29 years old, freshly divorced, and the closest thing I had to an asset was a laptop with a cracked screen and a resume that hadn't been updated since I was 24, and still believed marriage was something you built instead of something that got built on top of you. My ex-husband had taken the house, the car, and, in the quiet, bloodless way that lawyers make possible, most of my self-respect. I told myself I didn't need any of it. I needed money, and I needed it fast. And pride is a luxury you can't afford when your landlord is calling twice a day. The ad appeared on a private staffing site a friend from my old cleaning job sent me, almost as a joke. Live-in housekeeper, private estate, Vermont. Excellent compensation, room and board included, immediate start. No agency fees. I called the number before I let myself think too hard about it. The woman who answered had a voice like cool water. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said. "Eleanor Blackwood. You must be Claire." I remember being surprised she already knew my name. I hadn't given it yet. The interview took place over video call, and Eleanor Blackwood was, without exaggeration, one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. Not in a way that made you jealous, but in a way that made you instinctively want her approval. Dark hair pulled back in a low knot. A cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She smiled through the entire conversation, a warm, patient smile that never quite reached the rest of her face. "We're a small family," she told me. "My husband Daniel, myself, and our daughter Lily. She's 9. We need someone who can manage the household. Cooking, cleaning, some light shopping, and who understands the meaning of discretion. We value our privacy very highly, Claire. Does that concern you?" I told her it didn't. I would have told her almost anything didn't concern me. I needed the job the way a drowning person needs air, and when she offered me $82,000 a year plus full room and board to live in a mansion in the woods and dust furniture, I very nearly laughed in relief. "There's one more thing," she said, just before we ended the call, and something in her tone shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, like a single cloud crossing the sun. "There's a bedroom on the 2nd floor at the end of the east hallway. It's kept locked. It belonged to someone in the family who is no longer with us, and we ask that you don't attempt to enter it, or clean it, or discuss it with Lily. It's simply easier that way." I said, of course. People grieve differently. I had no reason then to think it was anything other than exactly what it sounded like. A room a mother couldn't bear to open. A private sadness dressed up as a house rule. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count since. How easily I accepted it. How reasonable it sounded. The drive up took almost 3 hours, the last 40 minutes on a private road that wound through forest so dense the afternoon light turned green and underwater. And then, without warning, the trees opened up, and there it was. The house did not belong in Vermont. It belonged on a screen, in an architecture magazine, in someone else's life. 3 stories of glass and pale cedar and black steel, cantilevered out over a slope that fell away into more forest, more silence. A long infinity pool, drained for the season, sat like a black scar along the west wing. Somewhere behind the house I could hear a stream, but I couldn't see it. wing. I couldn't see anything except glass reflecting more forest, more sky, more of nothing. It was, I remember thinking, one of the quietest places I had ever been. Not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your own footsteps sound like an intrusion. Eleanor met me at the door in person, and she was even more striking than she'd been on the screen. Tall, composed, dressed in the kind of casual clothing that is somehow more expensive than anything formal. Behind her, hovering at the edge of the entryway with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to make herself small, was a girl with dark eyes and a solemn face. "This is Lily," Eleanor said. "Hi," the girl said. And then, before her mother could steer her away, she added very quietly, "Are you going to stay long? The last one didn't." "Lily," Eleanor said, a little too brightly, "why don't you go find your father and tell him Claire's here?" The girl went, but she looked back at me once, over her shoulder with an expression I couldn't read. Not quite a warning, not quite an apology. Something in between. I didn't think much of it. Children say strange things. I told myself that a dozen times over the following weeks, every time Lily said something that made the hair on my arms rise. I told myself that a dozen times, and I was wrong every single time. Daniel Blackwood appeared for dinner that first night, and I understood immediately why Eleanor had described him the way she had. He was handsome in the effortless, expensive way of men who have never had to work for anyone's attention. Tall, silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been older than 45, dressed in a suit even though, as far as I could tell, he'd spent the day at home. 45. He shook my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure and told me, with a smile that didn't quite match Eleanor's but was equally practiced, that he traveled frequently for work and that I shouldn't expect to see him often. "The house runs on Eleanor's schedule," he said. "She'll show you everything you need to know." He was gone by the time I finished unpacking. I heard a car in the driveway around 9, and when I looked out my window, a small, comfortable room on the ground floor near the kitchen, clearly designed for staff. His car was gone, and it didn't come back that night. Eleanor gave me the tour before bed. Open-plan kitchen, living room with a wall of glass facing the black tree line, a study Daniel apparently used for calls, a wine cellar, a gym, a study upstairs, the primary suite, Lily's room decorated in soft grays and pale pink, 3 guest rooms, and, at the end of a long hallway that seemed subtly colder than the rest of the house, though I told myself that was my imagination, a plain white door with no handle-side keyhole visible, just a small brass lock plate above the knob. "That's the room I mentioned," Eleanor said. And there it was again. That flicker, gone as fast as it came. "We keep it locked. Please don't clean that hallway. I'll take care of it myself." "Of course," I said. She smiled at me, warm and unreadable, and said goodnight, and I went to bed in a house so large I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. I fell asleep almost instantly. 3 hours in a car and a lifetime of exhaustion will do that to a person. I woke at exactly 2:17 in the morning, and I woke because someone was whispering my name. Claire. Not through the wall. Not down the hall. It came from above me. From the floor above, from the direction of the east hallway, from behind a door with no keyhole that a woman I had known for 6 hours had specifically asked me never to approach. I lay perfectly still, telling myself it was a dream, telling myself sound traveled strangely in a house made of glass and steel, telling myself a dozen reasonable things. Then I heard, very faintly, the unmistakable creak of old floorboards under someone's weight, pacing, back and forth, inside a room that was supposedly empty and had been for years. And somewhere in the house, an alarm system began its soft, deliberate chime, arming itself for the night. At exactly 2:17, though I hadn't yet learned that this happened every single night, like clockwork, like a ritual, like something designed to make sure no one was watching the house at exactly the moment something needed to move inside it. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there until the windows turned gray with dawn, staring at the ceiling, listening to a silence that no longer felt empty. Chapter 2. The Locked Bedroom. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. Old houses, even ultra-modern ones built from glass and steel, settle and creak. Pipes groan. Wind finds gaps you don't know exist. I told myself all of this while I made coffee in a kitchen so clean it looked unused, and I almost believed it. Right up until Lily wandered in wearing pajamas printed with foxes and asked me, without any preamble, "Did you hear her too?" I nearly dropped the mug. "Hear who, sweetheart?" Lily studied me the way children study adults when they're deciding whether you're one of the ones who lies. "Nobody," she said finally, and reached for the cereal and wouldn't say another word about it no matter how gently I asked. I told myself again that children invent things. That 9-year-olds who grow up in isolated houses with distant fathers and mothers who smile too carefully learn to fill silence with stories. I believe this the way you believe things you desperately want to be true. Eleanor ran the house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every motion 1,000 times. She walked me through my duties: the kitchen, the laundry, the guest rooms, the enormous windows that needed constant attention because the forest threw pollen and dust against the glass. And every task came with an unspoken rule: efficient, quiet, contained. Nothing was ever explicitly forbidden except the room at the end of the east hallway. Everything else was simply arranged, the way rooms are arranged in a house staged for sale, so that there was nowhere for my curiosity to naturally land. Except, of course, that door kept pulling my eyes toward it, the way a scab pulls your fingers. It was recessed slightly into the wall, painted the same flat white as everything around it, with no keyhole on the visible side of the lock plate, which struck me on my second day as strange. Most old locks show a keyhole. This one showed nothing, just a smooth brass disc, like the door had been fitted with something closer to a safe mechanism than a bedroom lock. I mentioned it to Eleanor only once, framing it as harmless curiosity while I dusted the hallway credenza 2 doors down. "It used to belong to my sister," she said, not looking up from the mail she was sorting. "She passed away several years ago. I know it probably seems strange to keep a locked room in the house, but grief makes people do strange things, Claire. I'm sure you understand that better than most." It was, I would later realize, the first of many things Eleanor Blackwood said to me that was almost true. I didn't push. What right did I have? To me, I was staff in someone else's house, sleeping under someone else's roof, grateful for someone else's paycheck. Grief was not my business. But that night, I woke again. Not at 2:17 this time, but closer to midnight, to the sound of a door opening somewhere above me, followed by footsteps, unhurried, moving down the hallway and back. I lay in the dark and counted them. 11 steps one way. A pause. 11 steps back. The particular rhythm of someone pacing in a room too small to hold a real walk. In the morning, I found fresh flowers, white lilies, ironically, or perhaps not ironically at all, sitting in a small glass vase on the floor directly outside the locked door. They hadn't been there the day before. I was certain of that, because I had vacuumed that exact stretch of hallway carpet myself, right up to the threshold, and there had been nothing there. I asked Daniel about it at breakfast, the first time I'd seen him since my arrival. He looked up from his phone with an expression that flickered just for a moment into something sharper before smoothing back into pleasant detachment. "Eleanor likes to keep flowers by the door," he said. "For her sister. It's a private thing. I wouldn't mention it to her if I were you. It upsets her." "Of course," I said. I didn't mean to pry. "You're not prying," he said, and smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "You're just new. You'll learn the house has its rhythms." I would learn over the following days that the house did indeed have rhythms. The alarm at 2:17, the flowers that appeared and vanished and reappeared, the way Eleanor's eyes would flick toward the east hallway at odd moments during the day, as if checking that the door was still closed, still holding whatever it was holding. I would learn that Daniel left most mornings and returned most nights well after midnight, if he returned at all, and that his absences were never explained and never questioned. And I would learn on the 4th night that the footsteps behind the locked door did not belong to a memory or a draft or an old house settling into itself. They belonged to someone who was, unmistakably, still very much alive. I was up late, unable to sleep, standing in the dark kitchen with a glass of water when I heard it, not from above this time, but close in the hallway just outside the kitchen, the soft, unmistakable sound of the back stairwell door easing shut. I froze. The house's motion sensor lights, which triggered instantly whenever I so much as reached for the refrigerator, stayed dark. Whoever had used that stairwell had done it in a way designed not to be seen. I told myself it was Daniel, home late, avoiding waking anyone. But I heard the footsteps go up, not down, toward the east hallway, toward the locked door. And a moment later, so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, I heard the door open. Not a key turning. Not a struggle with a stuck lock. Just the quiet, practiced sound of someone who knew exactly how to open it, opening it, and closing it again behind them. I stood in that dark kitchen for a long time, my heart going much too fast. And I thought about the ad I'd answered 3 weeks earlier. Excellent compensation, immediate start. And I thought about Lily's question on my first morning. Did you hear her too? Her. I hadn't told anyone I'd heard a woman's voice whispering my name. I had never described it to a single person in that house. So how, I wondered, standing alone in the dark, did a 9-year-old girl already know? Chapter 3. Footsteps upstairs. I didn't sleep well after that night, and sleep deprivation has a way of making a person either reckless or paranoid. I became both. I started watching the house the way I imagined the house was watching me. I noticed the small black domes of security cameras tucked into corners I hadn't clocked before. One above the garage, one at the tree line where the driveway curved out of sight. One, I was fairly sure, angled toward the back stairwell I'd heard used in the dark. I noticed that the monitor for the security system lived in Daniel's study, behind a door that was, like the locked bedroom, always closed, though this one at least had a visible keyhole. I noticed that Eleanor never left the house without her phone in her hand, and that her phone rang at odd hours exactly once, and then stopped. Never a missed call notification lingering on the screen, never a voicemail, just a single ring and silence over and over, as if someone were checking that she was reachable rather than actually trying to reach her. I noticed that Lily's bedroom window faced the east hallway's exterior wall, and that more than once I caught the girl standing at that window in the evening, looking not out at the trees but sideways, at the wall itself, as if she could see through it. Children notice things adults train themselves not to. I was starting to understand that Lily had been trained less thoroughly than the rest of them, or perhaps she simply hadn't yet learned how badly the truth could cost her. I found her on the back stairs on my 6th day, sitting on the 3rd step with her knees pulled to her chest, and I sat down 2 steps below her without asking permission, because I had learned by then that direct questions made her retreat like a hermit crab. "I used to have a room up there," she said, apropos of nothing, staring at a spot on the wall. "Before, when I was little, Mom moved me because of the noise." "What noise?" "The pipes," she said too quickly in the flat recitation of a child repeating an adult's explanation word for word. Then quieter, not looking at me. "That's not really it, though." "What's really it?" Lily glanced toward the kitchen, checking, I realized, for her mother, the same instinct I'd started developing myself. "There's a lady," she said. "She was there before you. Before the one before you, too. Mom says she's not real. Dad says I shouldn't talk about her because it upsets Mom." She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "But I heard her. She sings sometimes, really quiet, and sometimes she cries." "Lily, sweetheart, do you know who she is?" The girl looked at me then, and for the first time since I'd arrived, her face wasn't careful at all. It was scared, plainly and simply scared, the way children look when they've said something true and immediately regret it. "I'm not supposed to talk about it," she whispered, and got up and left me sitting on the stairs alone. I should have let it go. I have replayed that moment 100 times since, imagining a version of myself who let it go, who did her job and collected her paycheck and never once looked twice at a locked door. That version of me would have been safer. She also would never have learned the truth, and given everything that came after, I have decided I don't regret the version of myself who kept asking. That night, I did something I am not proud of. I waited until the house had gone dark and quiet, until Eleanor's bedroom light had switched off and Daniel's car, home, for once, before midnight, sat cold in the driveway, and I went up to the second floor with a flashlight I kept in my duffel bag, and I walked to the end of the east hallway, and I stood in front of the locked door. Up close, in the dark, it looked different than it had by daylight. The white paint around the frame was newer than the paint on the rest of the hallway. A faint seam where a fresh coat met an older one, as if the door had been repainted more recently than everything around it. The brass lock plate, when I ran my fingers over it, wasn't a standard deadbolt housing at all. It was an electronic lock, the kind you'd find on a hotel room or a high-security office, with a small, nearly invisible sensor pad beneath the plate. This was not a grieving family's shrine to a lost sister. This was infrastructure. Someone had installed real security on this door, recently, deliberately, and had gone to considerable trouble to make it look, to a casual observer, like an old-fashioned lock on a room nobody entered. I pressed my ear to the door and heard nothing. No pacing. No whisper. Just the low hum of the house's climate system, and underneath it, so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't inventing it out of pure nerves, something that might have been breathing. So faint, then, behind me, a floorboard creaked, and I spun around so fast the flashlight beam swept wildly across the hallway, and caught Eleanor, standing perfectly still 6 feet away, watching me. I don't know how long she'd been there. Long enough, clearly, to see exactly what I'd been doing. "Claire," she said, and her voice was calm, unnervingly calm, the voice of someone who had rehearsed calm for exactly this kind of moment. "I asked you not to come to this hallway." "I heard something," I said, because it was true, and because I was too frightened in that moment to construct a better lie. I've heard it more than once. Footsteps. Someone crying. Lily says a great many things," Eleanor said, cutting me off, gentle and immovable. "She has an active imagination, and she's been through a great deal in her short life. And I would ask you, as her mother, not to encourage stories that frighten her further. She stepped closer, and in the dim hallway light her face was as composed and unreadable as it had been on our very first video call. "I don't say this to be unkind. I say it because I like you, Claire. And I think you could do well here, if you let yourself. But this house has rules for reasons you don't understand yet. I'd ask you to trust that. And to trust me." "Who's in that room, Eleanor?" For just a moment, less than a second, gone almost before I registered it. Something moved behind her eyes. Not anger. Something closer to grief, or fear, or both at once, tangled together so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. "No one," she said. "No one is in that room. I need you to believe that, Claire, because if you don't, I don't think this arrangement is going to work for either of us." It was, unmistakably, a warning dressed as reassurance. I understood, standing in that cold hallway at midnight with a dead flashlight beam pointed at the floor, that I had two choices: pretend, from that moment forward, that I believed her, or start packing my things. I told her I understood. I told her it wouldn't happen again. I did not, for even a second, believe a single word she'd said. And later, much later, after everything came apart, I would understand that in that hallway, at that exact moment, Eleanor Blackwood hadn't been lying to protect a secret. She had been lying to protect me. Chapter 4, The Child's Secret. I didn't sleep at all that night, replaying the look on Eleanor's face, that flicker of something that wasn't quite anger, until the sky outside my window turned the color of dishwater and I gave up and went to make coffee before anyone else woke. Daniel was already in the kitchen, which was unusual enough that I nearly turned back around. He was dressed for work, tie loose around his neck, staring at his phone with the particular stillness of a man reading something he wished he weren't. "Eleanor told me about last night," he said, without looking up. "The hallway." I braced myself for a second version of the warning, gentler perhaps, or harsher, depending on which parent had decided to deliver it. Instead, Daniel set his phone face down on the counter and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. "I know how it looks," he said. "A locked room. A family that won't explain it. I'd be suspicious too if I were you." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment the polished veneer slipped, and I saw something underneath it that looked unmistakably like exhaustion. "It's not what you think. It's not—" He stopped himself. "It's a medical situation. Private." He stopped. "Eleanor's family has a history of mental illness, and there are things about it that are legally complicated. And I would ask you, the same way she did, to leave it alone. Not because we're hiding something ugly, because it's fragile, and outsiders make it worse." It was, I would later realize, another almost true thing. The Blackwoods were extraordinarily good at almost true things. Sentences constructed so carefully out of real fragments that the whole felt truthful even when the shape of it was a lie. "Is it Eleanor's sister?" I asked. "The one who passed away?" Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, that I'd remembered the detail, or alarm that I'd connected it to anything at all. "Something like that," he said, which was not an answer, and picked his phone back up, and the conversation was over. I threw myself into work that day, because I didn't know what else to do with the fear sitting in my chest, and because Eleanor's warning had made one thing very clear. My job, and possibly more than my job, depended on my ability to look like someone who had stopped looking. So I looked somewhere else instead. I found Lily in the library that afternoon, curled into a window seat with a book she wasn't reading, and I sat across from her, close enough to talk quietly, far enough not to loom. "I'm sorry if I scared you yesterday," I said, asking about the lady. Lily glanced toward the door, checking again for her mother. And then, in a rush, like she'd been holding it in for days and simply couldn't anymore, she said, "She's not a ghost. I know everyone thinks I think she's a ghost, but I don't. Ghosts don't need food." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, food?" "There's a tray," Lily whispered. "Mom takes it up sometimes. I followed her once when I was supposed to be asleep. She has a key on a string around her neck under her shirt, and she waits until Dad's gone and she goes in, and she doesn't let me see, but I saw the tray. Toast, tea. Once there was soup." "Lily, has your mom ever told you who's up there?" "She said it's nobody's business, even mine," Lily said, and her eyes filled up, fast, the way a young child's do, without warning. "But I don't think that's true. I think she's scared of her. Or scared for her. I can't tell which." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed at herself. "I asked Dad once if it was my aunt, the one in the pictures who's not in the pictures anymore." "What do you mean, not in the pictures anymore?" Lily slid off the window seat, checked the door again, and led me down the hall to a wall of framed family photographs I'd dusted a dozen times without really looking at. Eleanor at her wedding, Eleanor pregnant, Eleanor and Daniel on a beach somewhere with a baby who must have been Lily, pregnant. She stopped in front of one particular photograph. A much younger Eleanor, maybe 20, standing on a porch with her arm around another young woman who looked enough like her to be a sister, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "That one used to have 3 people in it," Lily said. "I remember because I used to trace their faces with my finger when I was little, before Mom put it up higher where I couldn't reach. There was a man, right there." She pointed to the empty space beside the 2 young women where the composition of the photograph left an odd, unbalanced gap, as if someone had been cropped or replaced. "I don't know who he was, but he's not in any of the pictures anymore. Not one." I stared at that photograph for a long time after Lily wandered off, at the strange negative space where a person should have been, and I thought about locked doors and electronic locks disguised as old ones, and trays of soup carried up in secret, and a phone that rang once and stopped as though someone, somewhere, were checking a location rather than making a call. I thought about the word Daniel had used, fragile, and I thought about the word he hadn't used, the one hovering just behind it, dangerous. That evening, I did something that still, looking back, strikes me as either very brave or very stupid. I went looking for the old photograph albums, the physical ones, tucked into a cabinet in the study I wasn't technically supposed to enter unsupervised. I found them under a stack of financial documents, and I found, tucked into the back of the oldest album, a single page that had clearly been torn from something else. A diary, by the look of the handwriting and the ragged edge along the spine. Most of the page was illegible, water-damaged, the ink bled into soft gray ghosts of words. But near the bottom, in handwriting that didn't match Eleanor's careful, elegant script, someone had written, in letters pressed so hard into the paper they'd nearly torn through. She thinks I don't remember what happened that night. I remember everything. I just can't prove it, and no one will believe me, and I am so tired of being the one who has to be quiet. I heard the front door open downstairs, Daniel, home early, and I shoved the page back into the album, closed the cabinet, and walked out of that study with my heart slamming so hard I was sure it was audible. I didn't know yet who had written those words. I didn't know if it was the sister who had passed away, or someone else entirely, or whether the person who had written them was the same person pacing behind a locked door every night at exactly 2:17 in the morning. But I knew, standing in that hallway with my hands still shaking, that someone in that house had been silenced for a very long time. And I was starting to suspect that Eleanor Blackwood's carefully arranged household, the locked door, the flowers, the food carried up in secret, the alarm that armed itself like clockwork every single night, existed not to hide a monster. It existed to hide a witness. Chapter 5. Someone was inside. For the next several days, I did exactly what Eleanor had asked. I stayed out of the east hallway. I didn't mention the locked door, the flowers, the footsteps, or the torn diary page I now kept folded inside my own suitcase like evidence I wasn't yet sure how to use. I cooked. I cleaned. I smiled at Daniel over breakfast and let Eleanor believe she had successfully frightened the curiosity out of me. I was, in truth, watching more carefully than I had ever watched anything in my life. I learned Eleanor's patterns the way you learn a person's patterns when your safety might depend on it. She went up to the east hallway twice a day, once in the late morning, while Daniel was out and Lily was at the small private school 40 minutes away, and once late at night, after the house had gone dark. The morning visits were brief, 10 minutes at most. The night visits lasted longer, sometimes 20 or 30 minutes, and always ended precisely before 2:17, when the alarm system armed itself and, I now understood, made it impossible to move through the house undetected without tripping a sensor somewhere. Which meant that whatever happened at 2:17, the pacing, the whispering, my name spoken through a locked door on my very first night, happened after Eleanor had already gone back downstairs. It happened when no one, according to the house's own logic, should have been up there at all. I started keeping a small notebook, the way you might track anything you were afraid to say out loud. Times, sounds, the flowers which appeared every third day, always white, always fresh, always gone within 24 hours as if someone inside the room had taken them in and disposed of the wilted ones themselves. On the 11th night, I broke my promise to Eleanor. I want to explain why, because I've asked myself since whether it was reckless, and I've decided the answer doesn't matter anymore, only the truth I found because of it. And I broke my promise because that was the night I heard, through the wall of my own small room on the ground floor, a sound I hadn't heard before. Eleanor's voice, low and urgent, on the phone, at nearly 1 in the morning, saying words that stopped me cold with a glass of water halfway to my mouth. "She's getting worse," Eleanor said. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this alone. You said a year. It's been 3. A pause. Then, "I know what happens if she leaves. I know exactly what happens. That's the entire reason we're doing this." Another pause. Longer. "Daniel doesn't know everything. He knows enough. That's how it has to stay. For now, for her sake as much as ours." I heard her hang up, heard her footsteps cross the kitchen and climb the stairs, toward the east hallway, off her usual schedule, well past when she normally went up. I gave her 10 minutes. Then, in bare feet, Silent as I could manage, I followed. I stopped at the top of the stairs, in the shadow of the hallway entrance, and I watched Eleanor Blackwood do something I will never forget as long as I live. She reached beneath the collar of her nightgown and drew out a key on a fine silver chain, and she pressed her palm flat against the sensor pad beneath the brass lock plate, and she turned the key, and the door I had been told for 11 days led to an empty room, a shrine, a grief she couldn't bear to disturb, opened onto warm, lived-in light. I saw, in the 2 or 3 seconds before Eleanor stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her, a room that was nothing like a shrine. A made bed, a bookshelf, full, a window. I hadn't even realized the room had a window, angled away from the rest of the house, facing deep into the tree line where no one from the driveway or the road could ever see in. And a woman, sitting in a chair by that window, her back to the door, her shoulders curved in a way that made her look smaller than she probably was. The door closed. I stood frozen in the dark hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would give me away, and I heard, muffled through the wall, 2 voices. Eleanor's, low and pleading, and another voice, older, roughened, unmistakably a woman's, saying words I couldn't make out except for one phrase, repeated twice with a kind of exhausted, furious clarity that cut straight through the wall between us. "You can't keep me here forever." I don't remember deciding to move. I remember finding myself back in my room, door locked, sitting on the edge of my bed with my notebook open in my lap and my hand shaking too badly to write anything useful, thinking the same thought over and over. Someone is being kept in that room, not hidden, not grieved, kept. The next morning, everything in the house looked exactly the same, which was somehow the most disturbing part of all. Eleanor made coffee. Daniel left for work. Lily ate her cereal and asked me, without looking up, whether I'd had bad dreams, because I looked tired. "A little," I said. "Me too," Lily said. "I heard Mom crying last night. She thinks I don't hear things. I hear everything." I believed her completely. I spent that day going through the motions of my job with a kind of dissociated calm, my mind circling the same unanswerable questions. Who was the woman in that room? Why did Eleanor sound less like a jailer and more like someone desperately, exhaustedly trying to protect something? What had she meant, on the phone, by "you know what happens if she leaves"? And why, if the woman in that room was dangerous, did no one seem afraid of her except in the specific, guilty, protective way people are afraid for someone, rather than of them? I thought about the torn diary page. I remember everything. I just can't prove it, and no one will believe me. I thought about the missing man in the old photograph, cropped or erased from a picture of 2 laughing young women on a porch. And that night, unable to stop myself, I did the one thing I had promised myself, after the horror of being caught by Eleanor, that I would never do again. I went back to that hallway. Not to open the door. I wasn't nearly brave enough or foolish enough for that. Just to stand outside it, one more time and listen. I heard the pacing again, right on schedule, right at 2:17. 11 steps, a pause, 11 steps back. And this time, pressed as close to the door as I dared, I heard the whispering clearly enough to make out actual words for the first time since that very first night. "Please," the voice said, soft and frayed and unmistakably desperate. "Please, somebody. I know you're out there. I know someone new is here. Please, help me." I stood there with my hand pressed flat against that cold white door, and every instinct I had told me to run, to call someone, to do something. And in that moment, from the darkness of the stairwell behind me, a voice I recognized said my name, and I turned around to find Daniel Blackwood standing there, not smiling, not warm, watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. "You need to come with me," he said. "Now, there's something you need to understand before this goes any further." Chapter 6. The Missing Photograph. I followed Daniel down to his study, my legs unsteady beneath me, half convinced I was about to be fired, or worse, and entirely unprepared for what actually happened, which was that he closed the door behind us, sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk, and put his head in his hands for a long moment before he spoke. "Her name is Margaret," he said finally. "Margaret Ellis. She's Eleanor's older sister. I thought her sister was dead." "That's what we tell people," he said. "It's easier than the truth, and for a long time it wasn't entirely a lie. As far as most of the world is concerned, Margaret Ellis died 11 years ago." He looked up at me, and the exhaustion I'd glimpsed in the kitchen days earlier was fully unmasked now, raw and unguarded. "She didn't. But the man she was married to did. And Margaret was the one who was there when it happened." I sat down slowly across from him, my notebook forgotten in my pocket, every question I'd been carrying for 2 weeks suddenly crowding my throat at once. "Margaret's husband was a man named Richard Kessler," Daniel said. "Eleanor's family had money. Old money. The kind that comes with a great deal of image to protect. Richard was violent. Not in the obvious ways at first. In the ways that are hard to prove and easy to excuse. The kind of violence that leaves a person unable to explain, later, why they didn't just leave. Margaret tried more than once. It didn't go well for her." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with visible care. 11 years ago, there was an altercation at their house. Richard fell, or was pushed, depending on who you believe, down a flight of stairs, and he died of the injuries. Margaret called it self-defense. The police, and later a jury, didn't entirely agree. There were no witnesses. There was a great deal of money on Richard's side of the family, and very little sympathy for a woman who, by then, had a documented history of what her in-laws successfully framed as instability. Margaret was convicted of manslaughter. She served 6 years before she was released. Early, on good behavior, into a world that had already decided, based on a very expensive legal campaign funded by Richard's family, that she was a danger to herself and to anyone around her. "That doesn't explain why she's locked in a bedroom in your house," I said. "She's not locked in," Daniel said, and something in his voice cracked slightly. "That's the part I need you to understand, Claire, because I know how it looks, and I know how impossible it is to believe from the outside. Margaret has a standing order, a civil restraining arrangement pursued by Richard's family after her release, on the grounds that she remains, in their words, a threat to public safety. If she's found living openly, in public, under her own identity, they have the legal standing to have her reinstitutionalized, not imprisoned again, but committed indefinitely to a psychiatric facility her former in-laws have significant influence over. Eleanor has spent 3 years and most of what remains of our savings fighting a quiet legal battle to get that order lifted. In the meantime, Margaret lives here, under an assumed identity, for anyone outside this house. She doesn't leave, because leaving means being seen, and being seen means losing what little freedom she has left." I thought of the torn diary page. She thinks I don't remember what happened that night. I remember everything. She wants to prove what actually happened, I said slowly, that it really was self-defense. Daniel nodded. "There's evidence, we believe, that was never properly investigated at the time. A witness who came forward years too late, financial records suggesting Richard's family knew more about his temper than they ever admitted under oath. Eleanor's been building a case, quietly, for years. But it's slow, and it's expensive, and every month it drags on as another month Margaret spends locked away from her own life, in her own sister's house, because the alternative is worse. Why lock the door at all if she's not a prisoner? She locks it herself most nights," Daniel said quietly. "From the inside. She's not always well, Claire," said quiet. 6 years in that system did things to her that haven't undone themselves just because she's out. Some nights she doesn't sleep. Some nights she paces and talks to herself and doesn't remember it in the morning. Eleanor started keeping a key so she could get in if something happened. If Margaret needed her or hurt herself, or simply needed someone to sit with her until the panic passed. The electronic lock isn't there to keep her in. It's there because a keyed lock can be picked from outside by someone who shouldn't have access. And there are people, Richard's family, private investigators they've hired more than once over the years, who would very much like to know exactly where Margaret Ellis is living. And once I sat with all of it for a long moment, the pieces reorganizing themselves into a shape that finally made a terrible, coherent sense. The flowers Eleanor brought for a sister who wasn't dead at all, the food carried up on trays, the phone that rang once and stopped, which I now understood was almost certainly a signal system between Eleanor and someone helping with the case, checking in without leaving a traceable call log. The alarm at 2:17 wasn't sinister. It was practical. The hour by which Eleanor needed the house locked down and quiet in case anyone was watching the property, in case a private investigator had learned enough to try the door. "Why didn't you just tell me this from the start?" I asked. "Because the more people who know," Daniel said, "the more chances there are for it to reach the wrong ears. Housekeepers don't stay forever, Claire. We've had 3 in the past 2 years, and every single one of them left within a month, frightened by exactly what frightened you. Footsteps, a locked door, a woman's voice. We couldn't tell them the truth because we had no way of knowing yet if we could trust them. I'm telling you now because Eleanor believes you might actually stay, and because you were about to do something that could have gotten someone hurt." I didn't know what to say. I felt, in that moment, an overwhelming, disorienting wave of relief. There was no monster in that room, no danger I'd unknowingly invited into my own sleep each night. Tangled together with something colder and more unsettling that I couldn't quite name yet. A small, persistent voice at the back of my mind that Daniel's explanation, for all its detail, for all its emotional weight, fit together a little too neatly. A little too completely. Like a story that had been told before, polished smooth by repetition, ready to be handed to exactly this kind of moment. "Can I meet her?" I asked. "Margaret?" Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw something I would think about for days afterward. Not refusal exactly, but calculation. The specific pause of a man deciding how much more performance a situation required. "Not yet," he said. "She doesn't trust new people easily. Give it time." I said I understood. I went back to my room and I lay awake until dawn once again, not frightened this time, but turning the story over and over, looking for the seam where it didn't quite hold. I found it 3 days later, in the last place I expected. A folder of old newspaper clippings Lily wasn't supposed to have found, hidden in a box at the back of her closet, which she showed me with the guilty, thrilled expression of a child sharing a secret she knows is dangerous. "I found these under my bed," she whispered. "Dangerous. I don't think Mom knows I have them." The clippings were about a woman named Margaret Ellis, just as Daniel had said, a manslaughter conviction, a husband named Richard Kessler who had died falling down a flight of stairs. But the photograph accompanying the oldest article, grainy, black and white, clearly scanned from a physical newspaper, showed a woman who did not look anything like the figure I had glimpsed for 2 or 3 seconds through a closing door. The real Margaret Ellis was blonde, sharp-featured, nothing like the dark-haired woman sitting in that chair by the window. Whoever was locked in that room, she was not Eleanor's sister. Chapter 7. The key, I sat on the edge of Lily's bed with that newspaper clipping in my hands for a long time, my mind refusing at first to accept what my eyes were plainly telling me. I told myself photographs from newspapers could be misleading, grainy, badly reproduced. I told myself hair color changes. I told myself a dozen reasonable things, and none of them explained away the shape of the woman's face, the set of her shoulders, the specific angle of her jaw. All of it wrong. All of it a different woman entirely from the one I had glimpsed through that closing door. "Lily," I said carefully, "where did you get these?" "I told you, under my bed. I think they were Dad's. He keeps stuff in boxes and forgets about it." She studied my face, and whatever she saw there made her go very still. "You look scared." "I'm okay," I lied. "Can I borrow this for a little while?" "I'll bring it back." She nodded, solemn, and made me promise. And I did. And I spent the rest of that day working through my duties on autopilot while my mind turned over every conversation I'd had in that house, searching for the places where the truth might be hiding in plain sight. I thought about Daniel's carefully constructed story, every detail specific enough to sound researched, vague enough to be unverifiable. A restraining order I couldn't check without exposing myself. A legal battle that conveniently explained years of secrecy. A sister who wasn't dead, except that she apparently was, in every photograph that existed of the real Margaret Ellis. I thought about Eleanor's phone call. She's getting worse. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this alone. You said a year. It's been 3. 3 years, not 11. I thought about the woman's voice through the door. You can't keep me here forever. Please, somebody. I know someone new is here. Please help me. Those were not the words of a woman being protected by a devoted sister running out a legal clock. Those were the words of someone who believed, with real and immediate desperation, that she needed to be rescued. That night, I did not go up to the east hallway to be rescued. Instead, I waited until the house had gone quiet, until I heard Eleanor's bedroom door close and Daniel's study light switch off. And I went, instead, to the study itself, letting myself in with the small brass key I'd found, days earlier, tucked inside a kitchen drawer full of spare keys nobody seemed to track carefully. A house full of people so certain of their own security that they'd left small openings everywhere. The way people always do when they've convinced themselves no one is looking closely enough to find them. The study's filing cabinet was locked, but the lock was old and simple. Nothing like the sophisticated system on the bedroom door upstairs, and it gave way to a hairpin and 10 frustrating minutes of trial and error I will not pretend I'm proud of. Inside, beneath the financial documents I'd glimpsed once before, I found a folder I hadn't seen. Correspondence, printed emails, and, my hands going cold as I read them, a series of legal documents that had nothing to do with any restraining order, and everything to do with a name I hadn't heard once in that house until that exact moment. Vivian Cole. The documents were a mixture of legal filings and private investigator reports, spanning nearly 4 years, tracing the movements of a woman named Vivian Cole, a former employee of Daniel Blackwood's investment firm, the paperwork revealed, who had filed a formal complaint against him 3.5 years earlier, alleging financial misconduct so serious it implicated not just Daniel, but several of the firm's largest clients. The complaint had never gone to trial. According to a memo dated just after the complaint was filed, Vivian Cole had suffered what the document coldly termed a mental health crisis and had been the word voluntarily underlined, twice, in someone's handwriting, as if even the person writing the memo hadn't believed it, committed to a private psychiatric facility upstate. 6 months later, another memo noted that Vivian Cole had been released into the custody of a family friend at an address that matched precisely the Blackwood estate. I sat on the floor of that study with those pages spread around me, and the entire architecture of the story Daniel had told me 3 days earlier collapsed at once, replaced by something far uglier. Not a wrongfully convicted woman hiding from vengeful in-laws, but a whistleblower. Someone who had tried to expose real financial wrongdoing at Daniel Blackwood's firm, and who had been, I didn't yet know how, not exactly, not with proof, discredited, institutionalized, and then quietly, permanently absorbed into this house, kept somewhere no lawyer, no journalist, no former colleague would ever think to look. The locked room wasn't protecting a fragile sister from a legal threat. It was hiding a woman who knew something Daniel Blackwood could not afford to have the world hear. I heard at that exact moment footsteps on the stairs above me, unhurried, familiar, and I shoved the papers back into the folder with hands that had gone numb, and I made it out of the study and down the hallway to my own room just as I heard Eleanor's voice, soft, calling Daniel's name from the top of the stairs, asking if he'd checked the alarm system, if everything upstairs was secure for the night. I lay in bed with my heart hammering, the newspaper clipping and my own frantic scribbled notes hidden beneath my mattress, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like falling, that I was no longer a housekeeper who had stumbled onto an uncomfortable family secret. I was someone who now knew far more than I was supposed to, in a house where at least one other woman had already learned, the hard way, exactly what happened to people who knew too much. I thought about running. I thought about it seriously, packing my bag in the dark and driving 3 hours back to Burlington and never looking back, letting the whole terrible puzzle remain unsolved. But I thought, too, about the voice behind that door. Please, somebody. I know someone new is here. Please help me. Somebody had asked me for help. I didn't yet know her real name. I didn't yet know how much of what I believed was still, itself, only half the truth. But I knew I wasn't leaving that house without finding out. Chapter 8. The Truth About the Blackwoods. The days that followed were the strangest of my life. An entire household performing calm on the surface, while, underneath, I moved through every room like something coiled tight, waiting. I began watching Eleanor differently. Not as a woman guarding her sister's fragile privacy, but as someone I now suspected was, at minimum, complicit in something far darker. And I found myself circling back again and again to that overheard phone call. She's getting worse. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this alone. It didn't sound like the voice of a woman helping her husband silence an inconvenient witness. It sounded like a woman drowning in something she hadn't chosen and didn't know how to escape. I decided finally that I needed to hear it from her directly. Not through a locked door, not through stolen paperwork, but face to face on my own terms, before I did anything as irreversible as calling the police or a journalist with nothing but a photograph and a folder of legal documents I'd have to explain having found. I caught her alone on a Thursday afternoon, in the garden behind the house, cutting the last of the season's white roses. For the flowers outside the locked door, I now understood, not a grieving ritual at all, but a small, desperate kindness offered to a woman she was keeping prisoner in her own home. Whether by choice or coercion, I still didn't know. Her name isn't Margaret, I said without preamble, because I had decided that surprise was the only advantage I had left. It's Vivian Cole. Eleanor's hands went still around the rose stems. She didn't turn around right away, and when she did, her face had lost every trace of the careful composure I'd watched her maintain for 2.5 weeks. How much do you know? She asked very quietly. I know she worked for Daniel. I know she filed a complaint about financial misconduct. I know she was committed to a psychiatric facility 6 months after that complaint went nowhere. And I know she's been living in that room for over 3 years. And I know that whatever story your husband told me 3 nights ago was not the truth. Eleanor set down the shears with a hand that wasn't quite steady, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring past me toward the tree line, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual practiced warmth. It sounded, for the first time since I'd met her, entirely, exhaustedly human. I didn't know at first, she said, about the fraud. Daniel told me Vivian had a breakdown at work, that she'd become obsessed with the idea that the firm was defrauding clients, that she was unwell, that committing her was the kindest thing anyone could do for her own safety. I believed him. I want you to understand that I genuinely believed him, Claire, because the alternative was believing my husband was capable of destroying a woman's entire life to protect himself, and I didn't want that to be true. When did you find out it wasn't a breakdown? 18 months ago, Eleanor said. Vivian told me herself. Not right away. She didn't trust me at first, and I don't blame her. But over time, she told me everything. The trades Daniel had been hiding from clients, the way he'd manipulated the firm's records when she started asking questions. The psychiatrist who signed her commitment papers, who happens to sit on the board of one of Daniel's largest client accounts. Eleanor's jaw tightened. By the time I learned the truth, she'd already been released into what the facility's paperwork calls my custody, a private arrangement Daniel negotiated to get her out of the institution and somewhere he could control instead. I couldn't undo that overnight. I couldn't simply drive her to a police station and expect anyone to believe a woman with an official psychiatric commitment on her record over my husband's lawyers. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I kept her here, safe, while I tried to find a way to get her out that wouldn't get her committed again. Or worse. Worse how? Eleanor looked at me then, and there was real fear in her face. The specific fear of someone who had spent years calculating exactly how much danger she was in. Daniel has told me more than once what happens to problems that don't resolve themselves quietly. I don't believe my husband would hurt Vivian directly. He's not that kind of man. Or he wasn't once. But I no longer entirely know who he's become, and I am not willing to test that theory with her life, or with Lily's safety, or with my own. She wiped at her eyes with the back of one gardening glove, an oddly ordinary gesture in the middle of an extraordinary confession. I've spent 3 years building a case. Financial records I copied before Daniel thought to hide them from me. A witness, one of his former colleagues, who's agreed to testify if we can get her somewhere safe to give a statement. I've been so close, Claire, and so terrified of moving too soon and losing everything. Why didn't you just tell me? Because I didn't know if I could trust you. Eleanor said simply, because every person who's worked in this house before you eventually noticed something, and I had no way of knowing, in the moment, whether you'd run to Daniel with what you'd found, or run to the police, or simply run. I am telling you now because you already know too much to send away safely, and because I am so tired, Claire, of doing this alone. I believed her. I want to be honest about that. Sitting in that garden with the smell of cut roses and the low autumn sun slanting through the trees, I believed every word Eleanor Blackwood said to me. And some part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks half convinced I was living inside someone else's nightmare, felt something loosen in my chest for the first time since I'd arrived. It would be 4 more days before I learned that Eleanor's confession in that garden, every devastating, human, believable word of it, was itself only another layer of a story far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of us yet understood. Chapter 9. Everything I believed was wrong. Eleanor asked me in the garden that day if I would help her. Not with anything illegal, she was careful to clarify. Simply with getting Vivian somewhere safe, quietly, before Daniel realized how much either of us knew. She wanted to move Vivian to a friend's house 2 states away. A woman named Rosalind who had apparently already agreed, in principle, to take her in while the legal case against Daniel's firm was finally filed. I need someone to help me get her out without the cameras catching it, Eleanor said. Daniel checks the security footage. Not obsessively, but often enough that we can't simply walk her out the front door. I was thinking, the laundry deliveries. The van that comes on Fridays. If we could get her into the back of it, hidden before Daniel gets home. It was, I remember thinking, a plan built out of desperation rather than expertise. The kind of plan people make when they've been carrying a secret alone for years and have finally, exhaustedly, decided to trust someone else with it. I agreed to help, because by that point I could not imagine walking away and leaving a woman locked in that room for even 1 more week. We set the plan for that Friday. I spent the days leading up to it in a state of controlled panic, going through my ordinary duties while running through every version of what could go wrong. On Thursday night, I finally met Vivian Cole. Eleanor brought me up after Daniel's car had left for what she said was an overnight trip to New York, and the door opened onto a room that was, in reality, nothing like a prison. Comfortable, lived in, softened by the particular sad domesticity of someone who had been trying, for years, to build something like a life out of 4 walls and a locked door. Vivian was smaller than she'd looked through the gap in the doorway. Older, too. Maybe 50. With the dark hair I remembered and eyes that studied me with a wariness I understood completely. "You're the one who's been out there listening," she said. Not accusing. Almost grateful. "I heard you ask for help," I said. "I'm sorry it took me this long." She laughed, short and humorless. "Took you longer than it took the last one to run screaming out the front door in the middle of the night, so I'd call that progress." We talked for almost an hour. About the firm, about the complaint she'd filed, about the psychiatrist whose signature had put her away, about the terrifying vertigo of being told over and over by people with more power than she had that the truth she knew in her own body wasn't real. I believed every word of it. I believed it because it was consistent, because it matched the documents I'd found, because Vivian Cole did not perform her pain the way Eleanor sometimes seemed to. Carefully, at exactly the right emotional pitch. Vivian's grief and rage were rough-edged, unpolished, real in a way that made the hair on my arms rise more than any locked door ever had. It was near the end of that conversation that Vivian said something that stopped me cold. "Eleanor's a good person," she said. "Better than I deserve, honestly, given everything. But you should know, she's not the one who's been protecting me. Not really. Not at first." "What do you mean?" Vivian hesitated, glancing toward the door as if checking, out of long habit, that Eleanor was out of earshot. When I first came here, I thought Eleanor knew everything from the start. It took me almost a year to understand she genuinely didn't. That Daniel had lied to her the same way he lied to the board, the same way he lied to the judge who signed my commitment order. But there's someone in this house who knew the truth before Eleanor ever did. Someone who's been slipping me information for years, old financial records, dates, names, passed to me in books, folded into laundry, whatever they could manage without anyone noticing. Who? Vivian looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression made my stomach drop before she even said the name. Lily, she said. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. She's 9. She's smarter than every adult in this house combined, Vivian said, not unkindly. She's smart. She's been listening at doors since she was 6 years old, Claire, because nobody in this family has ever thought to be careful around a child. She found Daniel's old files years before I ever told Eleanor anything. She's the one who first told me, through a note folded inside a library book Eleanor brought up, that her father had done something to make a woman named Vivian go away. She didn't know what it meant. Not really. Not at 9. But she knew it was wrong, and she's been trying to fix it in whatever small ways a child can, for longer than any of the adults around her have given her credit for. I thought of Lily on the back stairs. Did you hear her too? I thought of the newspaper clippings under her bed, the missing man in the old photograph she'd noticed and remembered, the way she'd watched me from her very first morning with an expression that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite an apology. It had been neither. It had been recognition. One more person, she must have thought, who might finally be the one who listened. Does Eleanor know Lily's been involved in this? No, Vivian said. And I'd ask you not to be the one who tells her. Eleanor's carrying enough guilt already, about how long it took her to see what her own husband is. I don't think she could survive knowing her daughter's been carrying part of this too. I left that room that night with an entirely new map of the house forming in my mind. Not 2 adults protecting a locked-away secret from an innocent child, but a 9-year-old girl who had, in her own quiet way, been one of the bravest people in that entire house long before I arrived. I did not yet understand how badly I had misjudged who, in that house, actually needed protecting from whom. Friday arrived, and with it, the laundry van, and a plan that should have taken 20 careful minutes, and instead unraveled, almost immediately, into the most dangerous hour of my entire life. Because Daniel Blackwood's overnight trip to New York, it turned out, had never actually left the driveway. Chapter 10. The door finally opens. I understood something was wrong the moment I walked into the kitchen Friday afternoon and found Daniel sitting at the counter, still in his travel clothes, his car keys sitting in front of him on the marble like a small, deliberate accusation. Change of plans, he said, watching my face carefully. The meeting got moved. I decided to stay. I did not, in that moment, believe for even a second that this was a coincidence, and the look on his face told me he wasn't especially trying to convince me it was. He knew. I understood it with a cold, sinking clarity. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Cold enough to sit in his own kitchen, calm as still water, waiting to see what I would do next. Eleanor came down 20 minutes later, and I watched her freeze, almost imperceptibly, at the sight of her husband's car keys on the counter. And I understood that our plan for the laundry van, for Vivian's careful, quiet escape, had already collapsed before it began. What happened next unfolded so quickly, and with such strange, terrible calm, that I have had to reconstruct it since in pieces, like a photograph developed too fast and slightly blurred. Daniel stood, unhurried, and said, I think it's time we all stop pretending, don't you? Eleanor. Claire. I know about the papers from the study. I know about the plan for tonight. I've known for 2 days. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not, to my surprise, entirely without tenderness. The terrible, complicated tenderness of a man who still, in some buried way, loved the woman he had spent years lying to. You should have come to me. We could have found another way. There is no other way with you, Daniel, Eleanor said, and her voice, for the first time since I'd known her, did not waver at all. There hasn't been for a long time. What I did not know, what none of us in that kitchen fully knew yet, except perhaps Daniel, was that Lily had been listening from the stairwell the entire time, the way she had been listening at doors for years, and that Lily, 9 years old and tired of being the only person in the house brave enough to act, had already done the one thing none of the adults had thought to do. She had called Rosalind, Eleanor's friend, 2 states away, using a phone Vivian had shown her how to hide notes and numbers inside of. And Rosalind, an attorney, it turned out, not merely a friend, someone Eleanor had been quietly building her case with for over a year, had already alerted the state authorities that morning, setting in motion a chain of events that arrived, quite literally, at the Blackwood Estates gate at almost the exact moment Daniel Blackwood was explaining, calmly in his own kitchen, exactly how much he'd known and for how long. The sound of tires on gravel, multiple vehicles, cut through whatever Daniel had been about to say next. What followed was not a violent confrontation, not the cinematic climax I might once have expected from a house with so many locked doors and secrets. It was, instead, something quieter and in its own way more devastating. Investigators moving through rooms I had cleaned 100 times. Vivian Cole walking out of that upstairs bedroom into daylight for the first time in over 3 years, blinking against a sun she hadn't stood beneath in longer than I could imagine. Daniel Blackwood led out to a car by 2 officers with an expression of contained, disbelieving fury that told me, more than anything else that day, exactly how certain he had been that he would never actually be caught. Eleanor did not go with him. She stood in the driveway with Lily's hand gripped tightly in hers, watching her husband's car disappear down that long private road for what I understood, watching her face, would be the last time she ever saw him outside a courtroom. It took months afterward for the full truth to surface. The extent of the fraud at Daniel's firm, the psychiatrist who lost his license for signing Vivian's commitment papers under what investigators determined was significant financial incentive from Daniel himself, the quiet, years-long courage of a woman who had spent 3 years imprisoned in her own family's house, while still, somehow, finding the strength to help a 9-year-old girl understand that the people meant to protect her had failed, and that protecting someone else was still, always worth the risk. I stayed at the Blackwood estate for 2 more months, helping Eleanor and Lily navigate the strange, echoing quiet of a house with all its secrets finally spoken aloud. Vivian moved in with Rosalind, as planned, and testified, eventually, in a trial that made headlines I still sometimes see referenced in articles about financial fraud cases. Eleanor sold the house not long after. She told me she couldn't stand the sight of that east hallway, no matter how many times the door stood open now, no matter how much daylight she let into that room. I think about that hallway sometimes, late at night, the particular cold quality of its silence in those first weeks before I knew what it was hiding. I think about how easily I could have believed the first story I was told, and the second, each one constructed carefully enough to hold, right up until it didn't. I think most of all about a 9-year-old girl standing in a doorway on my very first day, asking if I was going to stay long, because the ones before me hadn't. I think about how she'd been the only one in that entire house who had never once lied to me. Not really. Just told the truth in the careful, coded way of someone who has learned that the whole truth, spoken too soon, can be more dangerous than any locked door. I left the Blackwood house in early spring, my car once again packed with everything I owned, though this time it felt like considerably more than it had 3 months earlier. Eleanor hugged me at the door and told me, with the first genuinely unguarded smile I'd ever seen on her face, that I would always be welcome, wherever she and Lily ended up next. I drove back down that long private road one last time, through trees just beginning to bud green after a hard winter, and I did not look back at the house in my rearview mirror, because I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't need to. Some doors, once they're finally open, don't need to be looked at again to know they'll never be locked the same way twice. The end.